Hi everyone, how was everything? At this point of our curriculum, we're already done with the economic indicators. We know what do we mean by GDP, economic growth, inflation rate, and unemployment. We have seen that we have two main diseases that faces the economy, which is high inflation and unemployment. And meanwhile, this actually comes with economic fluctuation, which causes disturbance to the economic performance. What we will try to do in our coming two chapters is to talk about theories that actually explains what happens and why does the economy fluctuate, in order to start talking about how to treat this, talking about the role of the government. So let's start with our first theoretical explanation, which is the expenditure multiplier. The expenditure multiplier is actually a theory that was constructed by the famous John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist. In this chapter, we're going to talk about how the expenditure plan and real GDP are determined when the price level is fixed. We actually will do our analysis in two phases. In the first phase, we're going to assume that the price level is fixed. However, we're going to relax this in the second phase and to see how would that affect our explanation or interpretation. We're going to talk about the multiplier. We will see that some expenditures in the economy will be translated in a bigger effect in the GDP than its original value. We will see how and why. We will see how this theory explains the fluctuation in the economy, the recessions, and the expansions. What is the triggering point for each of them? We will talk about the relationship between our first theory, the multiplier, and the second theory that comes, which called the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So, two theories are there, the multiplier, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We will start by the multiplier before moving to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's talk about our first theory, the multiplier. So here we're going to assume that we have a fixed price, as we are assuming that we are in the very short run. And according to this theory, the only effect that goes to the economy will depend on the aggregate demand on goods and services. What do we mean by aggregate demand of goods and services? Aggregate demand means the demand on all goods and services, or in other words, in the components of the GDP. So, in the very short run, the GDP will fluctuate due to the change in the aggregate demand, which is the demand on all goods and services. So, when we talk about aggregate demand, we have a similar term, which is aggregate planned expenditure. So the aggregate planned expenditure will actually equal to the components of the expenditure approach of the GDP, which is C, I, G, X minus M. Consumption, investment, government purchases, exports minus imports, which are the demands of the four sectors of the economy: firms, households, government, and the rest of the world. So now we have two terms. We know about the expenditure plans, which actually the aggregate planned expenditure, and we know about the aggregate demand. So first, our author is telling us that there are two ways of relationship between the GDP and the aggregate planned expenditure. In other words, as the GDP increases, this will lead to an increase in the aggregate expenditure. And increasing in the aggregate expenditure will then refeed a further increase in the GDP. Let's take an example to demonstrate this. Well, when our academy was built in this lovely acre of land, say that the early investment, or the initial investment of the academy, was 100 million pounds. So, by how much the GDP shall increase due to the 100 million pounds increase, more the increase in investment due to the building of the academy? The answer may be obvious at the first glance, that we'll go for the formula that says that GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the I will increase by 100 million. So the result of the equation, which is the GDP, will increase by the same. The fact is, it doesn't increase by the same. It increases by more than this initial increase. Why? Because, guys, when the academy was there and was established, this actually helped to generate more jobs for the people, professors, employees, etc. And those people received and still receiving salaries and income, and this actually will make them be able to make more consumption. And as they make more consumption, they will actually feed a further increase in the GDP. You fellow students also will, by this investment, actually encourage a further consumption, like consuming some gasoline on your way to the academy, buying stationery to support your studying activities. So the initial increase in the investment caused a further increase in the GDP, and this increase in the GDP encourages a further income, and this income goes to or lead to an increase in the consumption. So it's the two ways relationship between the GDP and the aggregate expenditure. So now we're ready to talk about the components of the aggregate expenditure, and let me remind you that they are CIGX minus M, and we'll start by the C, consumption. So we want to know what influences and what does affect the consumption, and how does it change with the different factors that may, or what are the factors that may affect consumptions. So first we have disposable income. What do we mean by disposable income? When you are graduated and you are interviewed for your first job, they're gonna tell you what salary do you expect. So you'll tell them a number. So they will tell you, is that gross or net? What is gross or net? When you're actually an employee, you will find that in your contract, you will find a big number for your salary, but maybe by the end of the month, you will end with a less number. Why? Because this gross number, or this original number, will be subject for taxation and different other ransoms, if any. So the salary that you take home is called disposable income, the salary or the income that you can spend. So here, what affects your consumption is the disposable income. We're going to talk about how does it affect your consumption. Comes in the second place, the real interest rate. So interest rate is the return that you receive over your deposits, or the interest that you pay over your loan. Interest rate affects consumption, but actually what do we mean by real interest rate? It's the difference between the interest rate and inflation. What do we mean by that? If you are receiving 10% interest over your money that you deposited into the bank, and actually the inflation rate is 20%, this means that by the end of the year, by the time you receive your interest, your money will buy less goods and services than when you begin the year. So this is a negative interest rate. However, when you are receiving a real return on your money, when inflation rate is less than the interest, what do we mean by real interest rate, which is interest rate minus inflation. Now, another factor that would affect consumption is wealth. The wealthier you are, the more consumption that you make, because actually you don't need more savings, because actually you are more secured. Let's take an example. If you want to save for your MBA, and you're gonna need £1 million maybe in 3 years, so you keep saving each year مثلا 30,000 out of your income for each year to cover for your master's cost and your master's cost and your living expenses. Question is, if the master degree suddenly has increased in price, what would that make for your savings? Will you save more or save less? Of course, you will save more to cover for the higher price of your master. On the other hand, what if you inherited $10 million? Will you save more? Of course, you will save less. So as we can see here, the relationship between your wealth and your consumption is a positive relationship. The higher your wealth, the higher is your consumption. And the less value is your wealth, the more savings you need to make and the less is your consumption. Now, let's talk about expectations. And here, expectations is related to expected future prices and expected profit. If people are expecting higher income in the future, they have less incentive to save and more appetite to make a further consumption. And if companies are expecting higher profit in the future, they are actually have more appetite for more investment. So if we were to summarize our talking about consumption for now, so if people are expecting higher income in the future, this means that they will encourage them for more consumption now. Same case goes for inflation. If people expecting high inflation or higher inflation in the future, they will run out and buy the goods that they can put their hands on before prices goes up. If you are expecting the prices of cars to increase, will you delay your plans of buying a car? Of course not. You'll try to accelerate it. So let's see more details about the factors that affects consumption. The first component of the aggregate planned expenditure. Okay, to understand the relationship between the disposable income and the consumption function, we're gonna construct an equation. This equation actually relates the consumption to the different levels of disposable income. And let me ask you a question. If your income is higher, will your consumption be higher or lower? The answer is obvious. The higher my income, the higher is my consumption. Same case goes for everyone. The relationship between disposable income and consumption is a positive relationship. The higher your disposable income, the higher is your consumption. And what happens to the savings? Savings will go in the same direction. Savings will go in the same direction. The higher your disposable income, the higher is your saving to. So here we have a positive relationship between the disposable income and the savings. So when your income is higher, this means that your consumption will go higher and your saving will go higher too. So in order to understand the relationship between consumption and disposable income, and on the other hand of the story, the savings and the disposable income, we're gonna construct a simple formula that describes the relationship between the disposable income and the consumption in one term, and the disposable income and the saving in the other term. So here, as you can see in the table, it actually shows the relationship between disposable income and between savings and consumption. Here, we have to know that your disposable income has only two channels, either to use it in consumption or to use it in saving. So for each level of these disposable incomes, you will find that the summation of both consumption and savings will be equal to the disposable income. And if we want deeper into the numbers, we will see that there is a positive relationship between the disposable income and the consumption. The higher the disposable income, the higher is the consumption. The higher the disposable income, the higher are the savings. So let's take the points here and start plotting it to our curve. And we have A, B, C, D. And we have another line. It's called the 45 degrees line, which actually splits our panel into two equal sides. This line actually have a very unique feature that coordinates over it will be equal, means that x equals y at any point of the 45 degrees line. So if we connected those dots, we will find ourselves with the consumption function. As you can see, the consumption function is positively related to the disposable income. The higher your disposable income, the higher is your consumption. On the other hand, we're gonna plot the saving points and its relation with disposable income. By connecting these points, we will find ourselves with another positive relationship between the savings and the disposable income. So disposable income has a positive relationship with consumption and with savings. Now we are to divide our curve into two parts. Our curve is divided in two parts. The first part, which is shaded in red, as you can see, we can see that the consumption function is above the 45 degrees line, which means that our level of consumption is actually above our disposable income. What does this mean? This means that we are spending more than our income. How come? Through using our old savings or past savings or the savings of others. So at this phase, what we are doing is called dis savings. Past this point, the green area is showing that our consumption is less than our disposable income. So actually here we are making a positive savings. As our disposable income is higher than our consumption, this means that now we are able to make more savings. So the consumption function is divided into two areas. The first area where your disposable income is less than your consumption, so you will depend on this savings, and the second part where your disposable income is higher than your consumption, so you will make a positive savings. Okay, let's go and continue with our function. And now we actually try to get deeper into our consumption function, which we know that it is positively related to the disposable income. And the question is, if my income is to increase by 1%, what would be the effect over my consumption and over my savings? So here this is actually calculated and figured out through what we call marginal propensity to consume. So marginal propensity to consume defines how would the consumption change due to a 1 unit change in the disposable income. In other words, if your income is to increase by £1, how much of this £1 will go for consumption and how much of it will go to savings? How we can calculate this? We can calculate the MPC, or marginal propensity to consume, by dividing the change of the consumption over the change of the disposable income at any 2 points over our data. So the equation for the marginal propensity to consume will equal delta C over delta YD, where the YD is the disposable income, C is the consumption, MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. Same case goes for the marginal propensity to save, which answers a question: how much, if my income is to increase by £1, how much of it will go for savings? So marginal propensity to save will equal delta S over delta YD. So it is the change in the savings over the change in the disposable income. There is a very interesting fact about the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save, that if we make a summation for both marginal propensity to save plus marginal propensity to consume, it will equal 1. Why? Because actually the change in your disposable income has to be channeled either to consumption or to savings. So delta YD, which is the change in your disposable income, will equal delta C plus delta S. So if we are to divide the both sides of this equation by delta YD, we will end up with this interesting formula, which is delta C over delta YD plus delta S over delta YD, which will equal delta YD over delta YD. So delta C plus delta YD actually equals the MPC, plus delta S over delta YD equals the MPS, and delta YD over delta YD will equal to 1. So the summation of both MPC and MBS will always equal to 1, as your disposable income has only two channels to go for, either savings or consumption. Now, how we can calculate the MPC graphically? Simply by taking the difference between the two, run and arise between 2 points over the consumption function to calculate the MPC. So as we can see here, the MPC will equal delta C over delta YD, which actually will generate 0.75. What this 0.75 means? It means if your disposable income is to change by 1, say 0.75 of this increase will go for consumption and 0.25 will go for savings. So let's see if we how we can do the same to the saving function. And here we have the MBC, which will equal to 0.25, and as you can see, the summation of both will equal 1. Now let's talk about the other factors that may influence the consumption function. We already know about the relationship between the disposable income and the consumption function, which is describing a positive relationship between consumption and disposable income. Same story goes for savings. Now what about the other factors? What are other factors? Here we're talking about wealth, real interest rate, and expectations. So if your wealth is to increase in value, this means that you will need less savings, and this means that your consumption will increase, and on the other hand, your savings will go down. As you can see here, we have a mirror image. Consumption goes up, so savings will go down. So why will my saving goes up? Why my savings will go down as my wealth goes up? Because you don't need more savings. You already secured. Your wealth will protect you. And on the other hand, if you were unfortunate and your wealth value went down, this means that your consumption will go down and you will need to make a further savings to regain your wealth, and this means that your savings will go up. Still talking about the mirror image. Consumption goes down, savings will go up. What are other factors that may do the same? Here we have the expected future income. If we are expecting higher income in the future, This means that we are less concerned about the future. We don't need to make more savings, so the savings will go down, consumption will go up. What about real interest? If real interest is to increase, this will encourage people to go and make more savings and make less consumption. Let's take an example. If you one day woke up and found this interesting advertisement that tell you that the bank will offer you an interest rate of 30% each month, but this is a limited offer for only 2 months, will you go and consume more, or you're gonna delay your consumption, tries to grab this chance and then to benefit from higher consumption? Of course, logically, you will save more and to consume less. So as we can see, the relationship between real interest rate and consumption is a negative relationship. Same case goes for inflation. If we're expecting higher inflation in the future, this means more consumption now, less savings, not to be affected by or to be hit by the prices in the future. So the other factors that affects the consumption function would actually cause it to go up or to go down, and savings will work in the opposite direction. On the other hand, we can see that these other factors caused the curve to shift either upward or downward, and here we have to differentiate between the change in disposable income, which caused us to move along the curve, and the other factors that actually caused the curve to shift either upward or downward. Now let us summarize. The real interest rate has a negative relationship with the consumption function. Higher real interest rate means lower consumption, higher savings. Wealth has a positive, wealth value has a positive relationship with consumption. The higher your wealth, the higher your consumption, the lower is your savings. Expected future inflation, if we are expecting higher inflation in future, higher income, it has a positive relationship over the consumption function. This curve actually is showing us the development of the consumption level in the United States from year 80 until year 2014. As you can see, there was a shift in this curve. Why this shift happened, especially in the early beginnings of the 21st century? Because the American economy had a long period of expansion that actually make the people more optimistic and have a higher expectation about their income in the future, and this encouraged them to make more consumption and less savings. Now guys, we are done with the consumption function. We are ready to go to look at the bigger picture, where we incorporate the other components of the aggregate expenditure, which are C, I, G, X minus M. We already done with the C, and we are to start talking about the rest of the components. So let's go for our graph and see how we're gonna incorporate these factors. First, we have the investment. Here, if you can see over our curve, it's not any more consumption and disposable income. Here we are talking about GDP and aggregate expenditure. So here we're gonna integrate all the components of the GDP, not only consumption. So first we have the I, investment. As you can see, it's a horizontal line. It's independent. It's not affected by the level of the GDP. Then we will add the government purchases. Government purchases also is independent. It's not affected by the GDP. And then we add exports, still in the independence or that not affected by the GDP. Then we're going to add consumption. As you can see, consumption is affected by the GDP as it's affected by the disposable income. What is missing of our equation? The imports. By adding the negative n to have the complete function, which is C, I, G, X minus M, we will end up with this lovely curve, the aggregate expenditure. It relates the relationship between the GDP and the aggregate expenditure. And as you can see, it's a positive relationship. So the higher the GDP, the higher is the aggregate expenditure. Now, we are ready to talk about the other components of the aggregate expenditure. We're going to talk about the I, the G, the X minus